Welcome, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin. This is McDuff Lives, and McDuff Lives One. Welcome back. You've been off for 3 years, and somehow they just let you out of YouTube jail. So now we're back with one, two, and three. Well, today's show, I would like to introduce Harley Schlanger with the following quote from his article. In the overview which follows, we will establish that whether he knew it or not, and most likely he did, Epstein was a deployed and protected asset of those City of London oligarchs and their American allies who used him as part of their plan to establish a permanent, unassailable empire, which imposed a series of global resets in economic policy. The ultimate goal was and remains to establish a form of central bankers' dictatorship run by technocrats with power over and above sovereign governments while undermining the capability of citizens to defeat their intent. Well, I think that's a frightening and very chilling, but very important concept. And let's get into it with Harley Schlanger. So uh, let's go. And welcome once again. I'm John O'Loughlin. Welcome to McDuff Lives and our special show that we call Harley and Me. And Harley Schlanger, so glad to have you back. Hello, my friend.
Good to see you, John. Good to see you.
All right. Well, it's great to have you back. And well, this recent article, which is in the Executive Intelligence Review, the LaRouche publication, is really got my attention. I think I've kind of had it up to here with Jeffrey Epstein and just the revolting things that one must confront when you study that subject. But you have done, I guess, an incredible deep dive into the history behind the creation of a Jeffrey Epstein and how he has manipulated our economy and taken liberties with just about every aspect of morality and personal freedom that our country is supposed to stand for. I don't know what else to say except for let's get started. So you start by mentioning that he was a math teacher at the Dalton School, and I can't pass over the Dalton School with the the Attorney General with the
Donald Barr, the father
Donald
of
Barr
equality.
and his book Space Relations, and the whole idea that this absurd, extravagant, immoral sexuality somewhere has been with Jeffrey Epstein for a long time. But anyway, we can go from wherever you want to begin, but let's state your thesis in your own words of what this article is saying.
Well, like you and most Americans, you were subjected to 6 years of back and forth discussion of the perverse sexual activities of Jeffrey Epstein and the rumors that the high flying, powerful establishment figures who were seemingly his friends, including Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, Bill Gates, Noam Chomsky, that this was somehow, it was almost like a life of the rich and famous, the debauched and perverse. But for what reason? What was this all about? And I think after a while, people were hoping it would go away, and they were hoping that there would be some closure for the young women and girls who were victims of the abuse. But what was missing here was the whole question of why. And why is it that Epstein, who was put in prison briefly in 2008, was allowed back out and continued to function in exactly the same way until 2019. So I wanted to look at this question, which, as you know, I've been working for many, many years looking at the various resets and the shift in the economy of the United States from the productive manufacturing, high-tech agricultural economy from the 1960s to the post-industrial rubbish heap of today. How did it happen? How did our establishment become so excited and enthused about speculation and disinterested in the standard of living of its population? So I started with just doing a map of Epstein's career against the changes in the economy. And things just started popping out. It was, it's almost one of these things where you say, how come no one else sees this? And there were some people who saw it, but they don't understand what they're looking at. And because of my association for many years with Lyndon LaRouche, I knew what I was looking at. That there was the intent, which you just read from the opening statement of the second article, that this was about a transformation, permanent. And it's a transformation that will lead to a small, increasingly small group of establishment oligarchs controlling the world economy, and virtually everyone else doing some kind of busy work for minimum wage. And the other aspect to it is, how do you get those people to accept it? To accept that they are not going to own anything, but they'll still be happy, as our friends at the World Economic Forum say. So that was the starting point of looking at it. So the thing that the other part of the intelligence investigation is follow the money, find the British element, because what LaRouche always said is if something is stinky and rotten, there's a British element there. And of course, we know that from formerly Prince Andrew. But then the question is, what was the intent? Who had the power to run an operation like this and cover it up? And so what I started doing is looking at, where did Epstein get all this money? As you pointed out, he was a failed college student who got a job from Donald Barr at the Dalton School. And then all of a sudden, he's picked up by Bear Stearns, one of the prominent, what's called white shoe investment banks in New York City. And from there, it's just one adventure after another that intersects the changes in the economy. So that was the overview that I took.
Let me ask you to give a brief understanding to us of the word reset, because I have over there on my shelf a book by a man named Klaus Schwab called The Great Reset. That was the first time I really encountered it, but you have in your article mentioned a series of resets, and the effect of these resets is not good for the common person. But what do you think we should understand by the term reset, and are we going to be having another one sometime soon?
Well, we're in the midst of one which now includes an artificial intelligence bubble, a tech bubble. I mean, essentially what happened is that for most of the history of the United States, I wouldn't call it a reset, but I would call it an advance on the idea of the American system, of a banking system that's providing credit for entrepreneurs, for innovation, especially in industrial and machine tool building and so on. And that periodically it would run into a problem where the economy would be going well, and certain people who were powerful would move in and try and grab a lion's share of the profits. The period of the late 1980s, or I'm sorry, 1880s, the robber barons. We've always had these, not exactly resets, but people saying, let's get the government out completely, no regulation, total free market, so we can steal more. Now, after that happens, there's usually a boom bust cycle. And in the bust cycle, government reasserts itself, as we saw especially with Franklin Roosevelt. But then again, at the end of the 1950s, John Kennedy, who tried to reinvigorate the economy using FDR's idea of credit, of investment in infrastructure, and even considered breaking the power of the Federal Reserve. Now, the leading bankers and financiers don't like that. And so the term reset, and Schwab was one of the people who really popularized the term, but I sort of imposed it on the previous times that happened.
It makes sense.
It's when they decide, how do we get people to accept the idea that we're not going to be an industrial economy? How do we get them to accept the idea that it's going to be low-wage service jobs as opposed to industrial jobs? And so by reset, they tried to change the notion of what is wealth. And in American history, we always had people who were seeking monetary value, monetary wealth. But we also had people who were inventors and entrepreneurs who took the profits from their businesses and plowed it into the next phase of technological advance. And very often, the technological advance was based on scientific breakthroughs. So you might say that was a positive reset, but that was actually over a long time, a continuous upward trend. Since 1971, we've gone in the other direction. And wealth is now defined by monetary value, which is, as you know, quite arbitrary, especially when after 1971, Nixon was convinced to take the dollar off the gold reserve system. So there was no longer something behind the dollar. And you had to take, in a sense, the faith in the good credit of the United States to accept dollars in trade. But for the most part, it held up. But what started happening was the growing demands of poorer countries for sovereignty, for the ability to use their resources and their labor force to produce something of value for their own countries. And this led to a whole series of coups and regime changes and wars, and also anti-imperial struggles, starting with the Bandung Conference in 1955. So it became clear to establishment academic hacks like Zbigniew Brzezinski and Kissinger that you had to have a change. You had to shift the idea of the nation state so that you would only have one sovereignty, which would be the United States, its alliance with the special relationship with Britain, maybe Europe as toadies under them, but the rest of the world had to be convinced to look for the best deal they could get as colonies. And this is what is breaking down dramatically today, but it's been in a process since the 1950s. Now, what happened then is that in 1971, you had the pound crisis in the late 60s. And then once the dollar was removed from the gold reserve system, that meant that speculators were now starting to determine the value of the dollar. Not the US physical economy, not gold, but what people are willing to accept, which led to a whole series of Ponzi schemes. But the first one, and this is where Epstein comes in, was Michael Milken, Drexel Burnham, and junk bonds, because it suddenly became clear to Milken in particular, but others in the Wall Street financial community, that there was a lot of value sitting in old corporations that couldn't monetize it. So how could you monetize it? And this began a whole series of ventures, including mergers and acquisitions, leveraged buyouts. But to do that, you had to have a pool of money to buy the stock. And how do you do that? Well, Milken came up with the idea of selling junk bonds, take stocks that are of very low worth and make them available to basically predators, a group of bandits who had access to cash. Now, who was that in the 1970s? It wasn't the Federal Reserve that was funding it. It came through what became known as Milken's Monsters. And it's written in a book by Connie Brook, Predator's Ball. Very worthwhile to read to get a sense of this, although she doesn't draw the full conclusion. Who is Milken getting money from? The Meyer-Lansky organized crime network in the United States. They were sitting on piles of cash. They had trouble getting it legitimized. So they had to figure out it served two purposes: the organized crime, and this included Lucky Luciano, it included Max Fisher's Purple Gang out of Detroit, and it all goes back to the Prohibition period, when these guys used bootlegging to start amassing a large amount of money. And one of the key people in this was Sam Bronfman of Seagram's. And so Milken figured out that the people who worked in those networks had cash. Then you needed front men for them. And the front men, in the best case, would be people who are not immediately identifiable as gangsters. Although in some cases, like Steinhardt, Michael Steinhardt, a billionaire hedge fund operator, his father was Red Steinhardt, who was one of the fences who got rid of the stolen goods for Lansky's mob. So some of them had direct connections to the mob. Louis Rosenstiel was another one. He was Shanley liquor. And he then sold that to Meshulam Riklis, who was a very big organized crime guy, who then took it to another level. He was the one who started selling junk bonds in the 60s. And he built up a couple of hollow corporations he used for takeovers. Milken studied this. He saw there was a big profit in it, and he convinced the executives at Drexel Burnham to let him do it. And so between I guess it was 1980 and 1988, there were 400 leveraged buyouts and takeovers, creating huge profits for the people who bought the junk bonds and then sold them. Then the people who bought the companies, takeover companies like Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts. I'm going through a lot of detail, but just to give people a sense of how it worked. They would buy a company, like the last one, 1988, RJR Nabisco, had tobacco, crackers, food processing, all sorts of stuff, but its profit level was low. So they did a $26 billion takeover and then started peeling the companies that were under the conglomerate off. And what they also did was they took the pension funds, they sold off, liquidated parts of the company, sold it to other companies, broke it off. So there's a huge amount of money, but by the time it got to the late 80s, it was so big that it took 2 full days to put the money, the cash, through the Federal Reserve System to complete the takeover. And people were saying, this isn't going to work because they're going to be bigger and bigger. We've got to figure out a way that doesn't involve cash, doesn't involve having to sell off stocks and bonds and things of that sort. So that's where Epstein first came in at Bear Stearns as someone who was a fixer, someone who figured out how to move money around, essentially a money launderer. And he was fired because of irregularities there. And he moved on to another company. He set up his own company. And he was one of the people who came up with the idea of collateralized debt obligations, where you figure out how you take something of value and cut it into pieces and then sell that. And what they used credit card debt as one source. And then the more famous one was mortgage-backed securities. So Epstein was on the ground floor with that work. Now, Epstein was not a controller of this. He was an operative. At the same time, what else was he doing? And this is what I find most fascinating. he was befriending people in powerful places. In 1971, when he's a college student touring Europe and England on a bicycle, he somehow became associated with Jimmy Goldsmith, one of the billionaires from the Clarendon Group in Britain. And Goldsmith was turned out to be a colleague of Robert Maxwell. And so Epstein was running around with these European oligarchs as a 20-year-old. So he was able, it says in most of his biographies, he was charismatic, charming, able to develop confidence in himself. Well, what else was he involved in? Arms trafficking. He became a student of Doug Leese, who later became Sir Doug Leese, who was one of the biggest arms dealers from Britain, involved in moving huge amounts of British aerospace or BAE weaponry into the Middle East. Through that connection, he met Adnan Khashoggi. The name should ring a bell. He was one of the big arms traffickers and money launderers in Iran-Contra. So here's Epstein suddenly showing up in very big arms negotiations and money laundering from that. And that's how he made his contacts. And he had his own companies. He worked with other companies, but he needed something that was more solid, more stable. And that's where he met Les Wexner. Now, if you want to stop for a second and ask any questions of what I've just covered, because now we're getting into the real story of where did Epstein get so much money to run these operations?
Well, I had a few questions stored up, but once you said Les Wexner, I thought, no, that's what I want to hear. I want to get into Les Wexner because, my good friend David Cranmer Underdown and I have had a number of conversations about him and the doings in Ohio, and importing, and of course, his companies and the beautiful ladies, of course, but the idea of such a huge criminal enterprise, I want to hear more.
Well, it's interesting. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and not too far from where Wexner was running his operation. There was also Carl Lindner, who was in Southern Ohio, and you also had the mob networks in Cleveland and Buffalo. But Wexner got his start, and his parents were small-time clothing apparel salesmen at a small clothing store. And he realized something that's part of the key to this whole operation, that if you can get enough volume of sales, in other words, not deal with the highest priced products, but you may have a high priced company in there, but mostly you have cheap apparel. That's what he did. He set up the Limited. Later, Abercrombie and Fitch was one of his companies. But he made a deal with this person I mentioned before, Meshulam Riklis. Now, Riklis was constantly hit with cases from these regulatory agencies. But Riklis's money came from organized crime. And Riklis made a deal with Wexner to help him finance the takeover of the Limited. And so Wexner used that. Now, these kind of apparel companies with big quantities of turnover, quick turnover, needed transportation. And so he aligned himself with a Pittsburgh, Columbus transportation company, which had organized crime connections. There's an interesting story about him, which I think is probably true, that he had an attorney working for him as he was building his business, who was called in for investigation by the IRS, who was shot in what looked like a gangland murder in downtown Columbus. And they never pinned it on Wexner. But this idea that he was a charitable guy, an honorable gentleman, is actually much more. Riklis himself was a total thug. And that was probably much more Wexner's style. And then he bought Victoria's Secret. And so he's known, he was called the Merlin of the malls because his clothing products were in malls, shopping malls all over the country in the 60s and 70s and the 80s. Now, he met Epstein in about 1981, and he brought Epstein in as, no one's sure exactly what Epstein did for him, except probably dirty money transfers and things of that sort. During the time Epstein worked for Wexner. Wexner transferred $200 million to Epstein. In 1991, he signed over power of attorney to Epstein, which meant Epstein could hire, fire, write checks, make purchases. He controlled what was at that time about a $1.8 billion empire. And in 1991, that was a lot. So that's where Epstein first got into the big money. From there, he looked for other investment opportunities. Wexner said that besides the 200 million he gave him, he might have stolen another 30 or 40 million. And it was through Wexner that Epstein got the mansion in New York City, the money to buy the Lolita Express private jet, and probably at least some of the funding for the $10 million for the island in the Virgin Islands, the chain that Epstein had. But it was through that connection that he was then able to start rubbing shoulders with the rich and famous, including Donald Trump, Bill Clinton, some of the people I mentioned earlier. So Wexner, the funny part of the story is when Epstein was first arrested in 2007 in southern Florida, Wexner said, "Oh my God, I had no idea that he was doing these kinds of things."
No idea.
It's like shocking that there's gambling in the casino.
I'm shocked.
Yes. And he said, "It's my bad judgment. I never should have done it." And he sued to get some of the money back. And I think Epstein actually returned $40 million to him. But then you come to the next phase. The feds were starting to close in on Epstein. And so there was a case in the Southern Florida district. The U.S. attorney in Southern Florida was Acosta. I think it's Anthony Acosta. But in any case, they were pursuing Epstein on charges of prostitution, sex trafficking, and so on. But in Florida, Miami, the Southern District. But in Acosta's own office, his deputy U.S. attorney was running an investigation into money laundering, violation of interstate commerce, all kinds of things. She drew up a 52-count indictment for illegal financial operations. At the same time, Acosta drew up a 2-count indictment for sex trafficking. They threw out they never moved ahead with the financial fraud. And they gave Epstein the classic sweetheart deal, where by pleading guilty, he was given a 13-month sentence at a Club Fed type prison. He was even allowed to leave the prison every day from 8 to 8 to conduct his business. So this became an issue when Acosta was appointed labor secretary by Donald Trump. So just keep that in mind. So here you had a case that could have opened up the whole story of the money laundering and the fraud and the drug trafficking, arms trafficking. Now we're blowing little speedboats out of the water, supposedly moving against Venezuela. This was actually a much, much bigger operation of drugs and money. So when Epstein got out of prison, he needed to find a new benefactor. Where did he go? Leon Black, the leading junk bond salesman for Milken at Drexel Burnham, who had set up his own private equity company and investment house. Black transferred over the period 2013 to 2017 or 2018, almost another 200 million to Epstein. So you can see the money going to Epstein coming from fraudulent practices, money laundering, and so on. Then Epstein would use it for other things, including expanding the mortgage-backed security operation. Epstein had a fund, and this is before he went to prison in 2008. He had a fund that was 40% owned by Bear Stearns, which was related to mortgage-backed securities. And when it blew out, Bear Stearns went into bankruptcy. That was the beginning of the chain reaction series of collapses in 2008. So Epstein had a hand in that. He was involved in another very large Ponzi scheme, which took $450 million from investors and collapsed the Tower Financial was the name of the company. And the guy who was running that company later said, that guy went to prison for 18 years. When he got out of prison, he said Epstein was the one who ran the Ponzi scheme. So he's all over the place in this. But the one attack on him was the two child prostitution or sex trafficking charges against him. So you get into the mid 2000s, the 2007, or when he got out of prison. What was he doing? He was investing in tech companies, artificial intelligence. He was working with Peter Thiel of Palantir, the very important military industrial complex Silicon Valley company. And then he was also working with Ehud Barak, the prime minister of Israel, former prime minister. This is the one that's suddenly, due to the reporting of Ryan Grimm, so prominent now. Why would Ehud Barak, a former prime minister, need to go to a guy who just got out of jail on sex charges to set up meetings for him? And who did he set up meetings with? Peter Thiel, Vladimir Putin. Why would Barak have to go to Epstein to get a meeting with Putin? With Peter Thiel, what Barak's company was essentially a spy service. It was a system. It was called originally Reporty and then changed its name to Carbine. But it was an emergency monitoring service that could be used supposedly for 9/11 calls and things of that sort, but which was a way of monitoring what was going on in every township where this was selling its product. And Thiel, of course, with Palantir was doing the same thing, metadata collection. So Epstein went from drug money laundering to financial innovations like collateralized debt obligations, mortgage-backed securities, then to connections to artificial intelligence, which is just data. I mean, just computer strokes, has no underlying value. And now we see this growing into a huge bubble. And that's, I'll say some more in a few minutes about the other aspect of this shift. But this is the process from the 1970s to 2018. They finally nab Epstein on other charges. And it's clear to me that if he did commit suicide, he did it under enormous pressure. But once he was gone, all of a sudden we hear nothing about this whole multi-billion-dollar operation. And the only one who pays the price for it is Ghislaine Maxwell. Now, let me just say a couple of things about the Maxwell connection, because this is important. Who is Robert Maxwell? He was a Czech emigre who became prominent through connections in the British Army. He had an MI6 connection, a Mossad connection, a CIA connection, and a KGB connection. He was involved in various kinds of financial fraud. He and Edwin Safra, who was a Lebanese banker who was very similar, were very much involved in funding the Israeli army. So with Maxwell, you have a connection for Epstein with Israel, which is probably how he ended up meeting Barack. Now, I couldn't find that Epstein had met Maxwell. I'm sure it probably happened, but he met Ghislaine Maxwell after Robert Maxwell died. How did Robert Maxwell die? Well, he owned the Mirror Corporation, one of the large British news services. And it turned out that he was stealing from the pension fund of his own company to provide for his lifestyle and for whatever other operations he was running. And in 1991, as they were coming after him, there's $460 million stolen from the pension fund. In other words, from the employees of his company. He was on his boat named the Ghislaine after his youngest daughter. And supposedly he was drunk and rolled off the boat and drowned in the Mediterranean. So probably another suicide. But it was through Maxwell, Ghislaine Maxwell, that Epstein had an entree to other British intelligence. But remember, before that, he was already working with Sir Douglas Leese. So the British side of it is very clear. The Israeli side, through his work with Barack, is clear. He helped Barack sell security systems in the Ivory Coast and in Mongolia also. So this is a big operation, an international operation. And that's why it's so disgusting that the media focused almost entirely for 6 years. He died in 2019. So it's for 6 years, the main story about him was sexual predator. And now it's coming out in a flood of emails. So I think this is a cautionary tale. Don't believe what you read in the media. The story of Epstein and his sex parties and that was designed to divert attention from the other stuff. I mean, he obviously had no moral standards. The kind of person who would abuse young girls and bring them to parties to be playthings for wealthy and powerful people will do whatever else he's asked to do, including money laundering operations and so on. So this is the kind of culture, economic, financial culture, which the reset from 1971 forward has done to the United States and to the Western world. And we either have to get back to looking at what is real value, which is the ability of a workforce to assimilate new ideas in the machine tool process to produce wealth, as opposed to create Ponzi schemes and figure out how to manipulate people to invest in it.
Thank you so much for that, Harley. It's so rare to find somebody that's got his arms wrapped around all of this, and it's just really a treat to have you here. So you're Jeffrey Epstein, and you're just seeing, well, there's this little island, this island I could buy, and you're thinking, maybe I'll buy this island, but there you are sitting on what, $200 million that you just got from Les Wexner, and how many other $1 million have you got there? So first question, why in the hell do you want to keep going with all of these schemes and criminal things that are eventually going to get you in jail and suicided? Why do you keep going? Why don't you take the money and run? And the second question is, why did he set up the little Epstein, the Epstein Island? Why did he set it up? What was his idea?
Well, this is the story that got Pam Bondi in trouble and Trump in trouble. The idea of an Epstein list the idea of the videos that he had cameras set up in all the rooms of the mansion in New York City, and in the compound on the island is actually pretty big also. So the presumption, and actually there are people who work for Epstein who confirmed this, is that every one of these rooms had several cameras and there were videos taken of what was going on in these rooms. Now, that's the classic, what's called compromat, and from when the KGB ran it. The Israelis do it all the time. And, the United States was not unwilling to do that. But you get video of someone who's a prominent person abusing a 13-year-old girl, and you can control them. And you may not want to use it as a threat, but they know you have it.
So Epstein has a criminal mind. Then he's going to go out and exploit people to the extent that he possibly can. But instead of just saying, "Hey, I've got a nice nest egg here. I think I'll just go live on a private island and forget about the world and enjoy the rest of my life."
Well, some people might have made that choice, but he was obviously someone who there was never enough.
So you don't think he had strings on him that were forcing him to go forward? That's what I was suggesting.
Well, I think there probably were. I think he knew that the people who were protecting him for a reason.
Yeah.
And
And that money was, I mean, money probably had a lot of strings on it that the big guys behind could pull if he got out of line, right?
well, it's also the case that there's thinking that he had video of Wexner and Leon Black also,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why these two suspended their good sense. I mean, Leon Black was asked, "What did he do for you?" And he said, "Well, he helped me with family planning and family business." Well, his family business was money laundering, was running these giant equity funds. By the way, let me mention this last part. The move to working with Peter Thiel, Reed, the head of the guy who set up LinkedIn, the PayPal Mafia, which is a grouping that Epstein ended up after 2015 working with. What were they doing? They were funding various experimental projects for spying, for internet control, data collection, and also transhumanism. They were looking into this whole question of how do you essentially decorticate human beings so they're willing to live a life of debauchery and no connection to reality. And this is a part of why he was talking to Noam Chomsky and working with his MIT project. People say, well, how did Epstein, a college dropout, how was he smart enough to talk with people like Noam Chomsky? Well, he organized Leon Black to give $5.5 million to the MIT project. Money talks in these circles. The other person he had completely under control was Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary of Clinton. Larry Summers, there are emails where Larry Summers is asking Epstein for advice on how to seduce a woman that he's interested in. Larry Summers is married. So when you look at Epstein, you realize he had no moral compunction at all to do these things.
Yeah.
And who else would you prefer to run these dirty operations?
So now let's go back. Let's take the step back at the big picture again and explain how it is that people like Epstein and Wexner and Maxwell and on and on and on, Barack, the rest of them, that they advance the cause of the City of London, Wall Street allied oligarchy.
Well, the problem that started coming up in the 60s and 70s was that the traditional banking, the source of commercial loans, was commercial banks. And yet there was not enough money in them to take part in the new high finance operations. So if you're going to be a player, you have to have an access to money. And so what is the City of London? It's a tax haven, offshore banking, money laundering that goes back to the Bank of England when John Locke was there in the late 17th century. So this is part of the British oligarchy. And if you can control credit, you can control these countries. You can control countries, businesses, and so on. And so this is the business of the City of London. And to have operatives like Epstein working for them. Klaus Schwab is an example of that. Schwab is neither a brilliant person or rich on his own. He was an operator. He was brought in to do some dirty work. If you're looking at the so-called brains behind this, you have to look at people like Jamie Dimon of J.P. Morgan Chase, or Walt Wriston of Citigroup. Wriston was the one who, in the 80s, pushed for deregulation of banking that led to the collapse of the savings and loans, then led to the repeal of Glass-Steagall. And that meant that now, instead of having protected savings and loans, you had the savings and loans set up as pools of cash to be looted by the commercial banks. That's why we had the 2007-2008 collapse. So you had some smart or clever bankers who were working on these strategies on behalf of the board members of the financial companies. Now, the people like Larry Fink of BlackRock. Fink is now a leading oligarch. He's got control over what's going on in Germany through the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. So these kinds of networks. And then there's the other one I should mention. This was also in the reporting from Ryan Grimm. There was a couple of emails from Epstein to Barack saying he's going to introduce Barack to one of the Rothschild heirs. And apparently they became friends, and she invested in his company. So, these are the old ruling families, the oligarchic families.
But we've got new oligarchs too coming out of the woodwork, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I was surprised to see, but I was happy to see Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders, on X. Somebody just played a quote of him, and he's talking about, hey, we hear about the Russian oligarchs and oligarchs, other places, but you gotta face the fact that America has its own oligarchs. And I thought that was good that somebody on the Bernie Sanders side of our politics would say, hey, it's not just a matter of the workers against the capitalists. There's this other dimension that we have to face, and that is oligarchy. And it just resonates to me with having, when you study the evolution of the British monarchy and into really rule by a bunch of the really old families of England. If you want to go back further into Venice and all that, but this idea of oligarchy, Americans, we think we're immune of that. We don't have that. Come on, we've got balance of powers. We've got the Supreme Court. We've got all.
But this is starting to break out because of the absurd lengths that it's gone to. I mean, just take a look at Marjorie Taylor Greene. Her resignation speech, what did she talk about? Oligarchs who control both parties.
Mm-hmm.
idea that the word oligarchy is now being tossed around, and look at the upheaval that's been provoked around the assassination of Charlie Kirk, the whole question of Epstein. It's clear to a growing number of Americans that the wrong people are controlling the system and that the vote means nothing. And if you want an even more clear example, in Europe, the European Union will decide who's allowed to win an election or not. And if the election is won by the wrong person, they cancel the election. So the idea that we live in a democracy has been discredited by the actions of these oligarchs. So the question then is, at what point will people have the guts to fight this? And I'll give you an example. In Germany, they're trying to build up the army to 600,000 or so soldiers. They have under 200,000. So they sent teams around to the high school graduations in the summer to try and sign up young people to join the Bundeswehr, the German army. And they thought just having people there in spiffy uniforms and things like that kids would say, oh, I want to join. No, the only thing that attracted interest from the kids was when they were told they could play with drones and video games. Now, if you have an army of people who are willing to fight only if they can use drones or video games, the war is a video game, it doesn't work. We see that in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. The Ukrainian military is melting down. It doesn't matter how much money they have. So the idea that you can manipulate people, and that's part of the whole function of artificial intelligence and these programs like at MIT. How do you convince people that, as Schwab said, they'll own nothing and be happy? And that's what they're working on.
It's the socialist paradise, man. We'll all be brothers and sisters, and we'll all own everything together. And whatever you need, if I have it, I'll give it to you. And it's all just going to be paradise, heaven on earth, Harley. Right? Well,
that may be what they're trying to sell, but I think Americans tend to be skeptical of these kinds of things.
So far, very skeptical, and it's a good thing. May I just mention that I just spent the weekend, as I've told you, down in Dallas for my first trip to Dallas and my first trip to a JFK annual conference, which I'm going to put all my thoughts together and do a show on what I saw, what I learned, and the amazing people that I met. It's just something. If I hadn't done that, I would have missed a huge leap forward in my understanding.
I went to a couple of those conferences, and I actually spoke at one in I think 1990.
Well, I've wasted a lot of opportunities to go, but I finally went this year, and I think everybody should have the experience of going to Dealey Plaza and seeing where it happened. And
when you just walk through that area, John,
yeah,
it becomes so clear what a phony cover story that Oswald fired from the book depository windows.
Exactly. It's just. And that was one of the big themes of one of the great people that I met, Jimmy, and his wife took me on that exact road. In the car, we drove and made the left turn, and you could see that from up there, 6 floors up, you couldn't aim a
worst angle.
It's just a terrible place to, and whereas there was a whole lot of, when he was coming directly toward the book depository, he had a clear shot, and the car kept getting closer to the building. So it was, and they didn't shoot there. Why? Well, because that's not where the shooters were. That's why.
Grassy knoll, the infamous grassy knoll.
Yeah, and so that's been my answer to your question earlier is, what is it going to take for the American people to see this and to shake the tree and make it better. And My answer is the exposition of the truth in the JFK assassination. Something that we keep having our politicians and everybody else just refuse. They're afraid. It's
But
just,
look what happened when Trump reversed his initial decision to release the files on Epstein. The
yeah,
blowback against him, and eventually, because of Marjorie Taylor Greene and Massey and Boebert and a couple of others, he had to reverse himself. But the files haven't been released yet.
they haven't.
I don't think Bondi's going to release them.
And why did Trump go throw over the top with his language on Marjorie Taylor Greene and Thomas Massey? I mean, he basically called them treasonous traitors, the scum of the earth. That was a little bit of overkill. Well, why did he have to go that far?
Especially when the two of them are the best example of what the MAGA movement is supposedly about.
Exactly.
I just wrote a little piece on that. I'll send it to you.
And
If people want to get my article,
yeah,
it's coming out on Thursday in the Executive Intelligence Review online, subscription only. But because of our friendship and our long-term discussion with your audience, if people in your audience would like to get a copy, pre-publication copy, send me an email and I'll send it to you. It's harleysch@gmail.com, harleysch@gmail.com. And if you send it to me, I'll send out the pre-publication, like what I sent to you.
that's fantastic, Harley. Get the copy, guys. It's essential reading, and you'll understand Epstein a whole lot better after you've gone through it. Harley Schlanger, such a pleasure. I hope to see you again in about 2 weeks.
I hope so too.
All right. And
happy Thanksgiving to everyone there. We don't have it here.
Okay. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody. Thanks so much, everyone, for being here at McDuff Lives. And welcome back, McDuff Lives 1 people. It's great to have you back.